It is a it is a topic that lawmakers want to talk about. It is something that their constituency cares about. It affects their pocketbooks. Um, and they are truly making their voices heard. And so, this is I sort of use this as a lesson of democracy in action for my kids. I do think that leaders in Washington are hearing us and starting to make that determination. Do I appease industry? Do I keep my voters engaged on this issue? And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing this acceleration.
Welcome to Broken Benefits. I'm your host, Lee Lewis, and this is a podcast where we learn from top employer experts on how to fix our broken benefits to save lives, save dollars, and save your talent. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Broken Benefits. So excited to be joined today by Chris Deacon. Chris is, if you've been living under a rock, she ran a $4 billion health fund with the state of New Jersey. She has served at that time as the Deputy Attorney General and has been a leading voice in the country, helping large employers and policymakers and generally, everyone being able to speak truth to the vendors in our space and to help advocate for ultimately the patient and the health plans who help make sure that they have access to care. Chris, so glad to have you on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be back.
Yes, yes, yes. So there's a lot going on right now, both on the PBM space, within hospitals, with new legislation. As you're starting to look at this, I want to take a step back. Do you feel like things are accelerating and that change is coming more quickly, or is it just kind of a recency bias?
No, I definitely think the former and not the latter. It's accelerating. It's coming fast and furious. It's like drinking out of a fire hose, trying to keep up with the latest in PBMs right now is and who's testifying, in the House or Senate on PBMs or healthcare. It is definitely accelerated. And you didn't ask, but I'll tell you why I think part of the reason is not only sort of the obvious, you know, ballooning cost of healthcare in the country and exceeding 5 trillion in this year and on pace to really blow through that as we go forward. But it is a topic that lawmakers want to talk about. It is something that their constituency cares about. It affects their pocketbooks. Um, and they are truly making their voices heard. And so, I sort of use this as a lesson of democracy in action for my kids. I do think that leaders in Washington are hearing us and starting to make that determination. Do I appease industry? Do I keep my voters engaged on this issue? And I think that's part of the reason we're seeing this acceleration.
Everyone, now just a quick word from today's sponsor.
Lemonade for 50 cents. It's for a good cause.
This situation seems terrible, right? Well, what if I told you it actually happened in the United States in 2021? These are the families of people who work for companies just like yours. Give your employees 100% medical coverage with Catalyze Health.
I love that. What do you think is the most impactful trend that you're seeing right now, between the medical side, hospital side, pricing side, and PBM?
Yeah, I mean, I think from a macro perspective, not to sound trite, but this emphasis on transparency and whether that's in the PBM space and knowing where all the money is going in that supply chain and um or in the healthcare side or on medical side and claims data and hospital price transparency and tick coverage, the transparency and coverage rules. And then, Department of Labor just came out with new uh, PBM regs. So I think as a theme at a macro level, like that transparency piece is really what's happening at a foundational level, and then that's serving and will serve to accelerate the change that happens after at a more micro level. So if that's, like you said, like hospital pricing caps, because we're seeing how, how much money is being spent there, or if it's, regulating PBMs in a different manner, or, some of the more creative bills, breaking up the big insurance companies, right? One of the things that came to light in some of these hearings is like the absolute, like the vast amount of vertical integration that's happened in these companies. And so, result, we have a bill, to break them up. So, yeah, macro transparency, micro, I think we're going to see a lot accelerating pretty quickly.
One thing I always like to do on the podcast is to get tactical. Just personally, that's my bias on everything as well, is there's major trends and new legislation things occurring in the marketplace. How do we take the lessons from that and make that immediately applicable within our groups? And maybe we can look at some of these on a piece by piece. Let's start with PBM. New Lots of new legislation coming out with PBM. If you're running a health plan, how do you react with common sense tactical approaches here during 2026 going into 1/1/27?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you, some examples of work I'm working on now as a result of
Yeah.
some of these changes is some groups that are going out to RFP for their PBM in 2027, or for a plan year 2027. It's no longer sort of the standard off the shelf RFP for a PBM. Like, we have to now account for these regulatory changes, some of the changes in the FTC order that are applicable to Express Scripts, um, for what that contract might look like, not just in 2027, but 2028 and 2029. So what are those changes? Okay. And what might be the future reality in terms of, rebates and pass-throughs and no rebates, maybe no, doing away with spread pricing. Well, I'm now in a position when I am going out to RFP to say, look, I have I have a regulation, I have a law, I have an FTC order that says this is going to be dead, right? By the time our contract is in play, or at least a year into it, we're going to do things differently. And I think that positions you as an employer or your consultant to really have the leverage to push harder and further down that, sort of road of being more transparent and pushing to do things differently. Whereas before, yes, we want to be more transparent. We want complete pass through. There's a lot of aspirational things that employers want, but like it's actually tangible and you can point to it and give a statutory citation. That's powerful. And so when you say, I think you should play ball, I think that that's at a whole new volume right now.
Yeah. It's really to anchor in on those requirements.
Right. And you should absolutely be going out to RFP or talking about renegotiating your contracts if you aren't, as a result of some of these changes.
How do you think I get into debates on this all the time? Big 3 PBMs, they get superior, costing. They have all the market power. They do have the best pricing available to them. Nevertheless, smaller PBMs that might be more transparent, more flexible will uh will will come in and also make an alternative pitch. I don't know if you have sort of a pros and cons on either side of that, or does all this legislation make it easier to transact with a big 3 PBM with confidence, or is it still there's too much uncertainty? Tell me your thoughts there. And I know there's pros and cons to both sides. It's a good debate, and I have great, smart people on both sides, so I don't know that there's a wrong answer here.
No, I think it's too soon to say with certainty. I do believe that there's the writing on the wall, really not on the wall anymore in statute, that things are changing. And but I think if you look at the market and look at what the response from the big three was to some of the more recent, decisions, the FTC order with ESI, some of the legislation, it wasn't catastrophic, right? Like the stock prices didn't tank. They weren't caught on their back foot. They were ready, um, which I think it could mean a few things and maybe probably some combination of all of the above. That they are of the understanding that they have to start to do things differently. But also, what are the ways that they are going to perhaps shift the way that they conduct their PBM business, but not necessarily um, negatively impact the enterprise, right?
Sure. Yeah, they have an obligation to make sure shareholders are protected, so the net change can't be, significantly different. It just needs to be calibrated with a different business model.
Right. And if you look at, if you were to look at any sort of investor deck or earnings call presentation of any of the big three and their parent companies, what you'll see is, sort of that. I don't think it's the flywheel. I'm sure they have flywheels in their decks, but um, the suite of services, they have the insurance arm, they have the care delivery arm, they have the PBM arm, and then the specialty pharmacy arm, right? And sort of everything in between. And so if I'm pushing on the PBM profitability, and exerting some real downward pressure there, they still have a lot of other levers to pull, which is why I'm a big advocate right now for going further than just PBM transparency, because at the end of the day, these are enterprise organizations. But yeah, so I mean, more to be seen. I think it's all positive progress.
Let's look at medical. What are the major trends that you're seeing within medical, carrier interactions, and how do those affect the way that we ought to think about working with our carriers and TPAs?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of micro trends. One in particular that I think about a lot that just because I've probably heard it multiple times over the last, few months. And that's, as clients were getting their premiums or the renewals, and then, the claims experience is coming in for 2025 or, the end of last part of 2025. Um, the high cost claimants are the way that they're being dealt with is a little concerning to me. What I hear a lot is, yes, those are the high cost claimants. They're over here in this bucket. And if we take them out of our trends and if we take them out of sort of our broader look of the population and their spend and trend, you're probably at like 8 to 10% or whatever the number is, right? It's not negative. um,
Yeah.
but my concern is that the these high cost claimants are not simply going away. They are only going to ramp up, right? Like, you didn't just have a bad year. As these new drugs come to market, you are going to have more $2 million CAR T cell therapies. You're going to have more, you know, $1 million drugs. You are going to have more high cost claimants in the hospital as some of the services continue to sort of rise in that cost trajectory. So it feels like we're just sort of we're definitely on our heels and on our back feet when it comes to dealing with these problems that are going to be with us and increasingly with us. So it's not just enough to say anymore, yeah, that's in another bucket. If we don't look at those, we did pretty well, or we did how everybody else is doing.
Okay. I want to pause on this one for a minute. Cell and gene. Uh, New drugs are coming out. Every time a new one comes out, it doesn't get cheaper. It's not like a TV. It's going in the opposite direction. They're adding $1 million to the cost. We've got whatever, 1 million, 2 million, 3 million. I'm sure the first $5 million drug is in development. The first $10 million drug is not far behind it. If no one ever says no, then they just are going to add and add and add, and there's no incentive to lower cost. This is one of the biggest quandaries that that I'm having to deal with all the time. If you're now running the New Jersey plan and you're able to, or any plan, you're running a health plan, what do you do to insert some type of adult supervision into this marketplace? Because if no one can ever say no, we're stuck with it forever. We've got to have some way to push back.
Yeah, I think with size comes a little bit of power. And I think those that have the size and the power have an obligation to use it to try and get those costs under control. And I think it has to be a hybrid of a new approach to risk management and financing for those million-plus-dollar drugs, right? And also some sort of exertion like downward on the price. There has to be a ceiling somewhere, right? And right now
Somewhere.
there's not. Um, so I mean,
And say we put in a ceiling at 4 million,
yeah,
then every new drug comes out at 4 million, right? It's
right,
like,
right, right. Um, yeah. So again, how you deal with it as an employer, I think that, and I think we've talked about this, is are there interesting, again, financing models and risk models that allow numbers of employers or even from a public space to provide some sort of like risk protection after a certain attachment point, right? I mean, if you look at, for example, when end-stage renal disease was put on the list of a very short list of conditions for which Medicare, like if you suffer for over, whatever it is, 30 months, 36 months, yeah, you get to go onto Medicare. I mean, the genesis for that was because it became an unsustainable or, ridiculous cost that nobody thought employers should have to bear, right? Because these people are going to be, sustaining this cost and so the idea for that still very much exists, right? But for some reason, and I'm not saying it's positive or negative, but that's, we sort of stopped at end-stage renal disease. But the logic, right, is that at a certain attachment point, should we all be sharing collectively in this risk, and would it be um more advantageous, again, from being able to exert some pricing pressure if there was a backstop, perhaps, a government entity or whatever. And we are more, um, we're being more intelligent about how we're allocating that risk. Because right now we're all, you know, one employer with 500 employees shouldn't be bearing the research and development costs for the $5 million drug because one of their members happens to have this rare disease,
yeah,
right? And so, I mean, you get into that philosophical debate. Is it a cost that should be borne more broadly, right?
yeah.
But yeah, those are a couple.
I love this. So as we now stepping back to how we're thinking about high cost claimants generally, it's by no means not just cell and gene, it's a lot of cancer, rare treatments, specialty drugs, infusions, lots of different therapies are quite expensive and medical trend is going up. How do we as a health plan think about those high cost claims? Because as you just mentioned, we exclude those when we think about trend, but they're hammering our trend. So how should we react?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, you can't bucket them and say, yeah, well, we can't control that, so we're not going to worry about it. Um, and some might think if you are of a size where you do need stop loss, um, you have to have I think, a strategy for really reviewing those claims, seeing where there is opportunity to um, either exert some downward pressure on the cost, or if that means medical bill review, if that means trying to source drugs differently, you have to look at those as an opportunity. I mean, I'm always astounded by how much time and energy employers are willing to spend on like to get an engagement level up on like a screening tool or a wellness thing, right?
Yeah.
And um and if like a tenth of that time could be put into like diving into like two of these claims, like your return on investment is just massive. But I think the fallacy is that employers think it's outside of their control to do anything about it. Um, and that it's, sort of it's a lost cause, right? It is what it is. We can't control that. And you can't after it's happened, but there are things you can do to try and, again, mitigate that cost and then mitigate that cost going forward. And there could be creative, stop loss solutions, or do you go with a captive, or do you I think there's a number of different ways to think about it, but the problem is just saying like, oh, well, let's not think about those when we talk about our trend.
Makes perfect sense. So echoing back my words, not yours, is when we're going to RFP, don't just ignore your high cost claimants in your comparative analysis. When you are looking at your strategies and tactics on a year over year basis, don't ignore just, oh, well, we have a bunch of high cost claims. We don't need to worry about that. And then finally, when we're thinking about audit, fraud, waste, and abuse, things along those lines, zero in on your high cost claimants rather than just kind of my random sample of Z-Packs and office consultations, but really look closely at the large claims.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, another, sort of anecdotal, was looking at a list of high cost claimants, and it wasn't sort of a really exhaustive. It was very high level information, but you could see, at least one of them was, I'm making this up because I don't want to say something from a client, but more or less, something bad happened in the surgery room that was the surgeon's fault. And therefore, this very routine procedure became something that was not routine and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, one of the questions was like, okay, what are your subrogation numbers look like? A few of these claims look like they could have a third party payer that should be stepping in here to, or maybe readmissions policies that might be applicable that wouldn't make these claims subject to reimbursement. And, it's kind of like crickets. Again, it's just paying really close attention to where the dollars go.
Oh, that's awesome. Let's talk about consultants.
Yes.
So, new stuff coming both in transparency. We have the new sort of these new class action lawsuits that are fascinating with double defendants, where it's both the health plan and the consultant are getting both uh, litigated against. Uh, how should we think about this? I'm running a health plan. How should I think about this in terms of the way I interact with my consultant? Do we think that the business model is going to be changing? And uh, what are the next steps?
Yeah,
And maybe summarize a little bit of what these changes are. I'm sort of speaking as though everyone knows, but that's a bad
I
assumption.
make that mistake a lot too. So yeah, so just generally the lawsuits that we're talking about, well, I think the backup, we were all sort of worried about this wave of litigation from, employees, like classes of employees filing class action suits against their employers for breach of fiduciary duty on their health plan, right? Because they weren't managing it prudently, they weren't, they were overpaying for drugs and PBMs. Those lawsuits by and large have been dismissed. They were dismissed because the plaintiffs couldn't establish a concrete injury sufficient to get standing. And so Schlichter, this new wave of lawsuits, I think it's really sort of brilliant, if I can use that word. Instead of going with the health benefits plan, got creative and said, okay, we're going to bring breach of fiduciary duty suits on the voluntary benefit side. Okay, so the employers are now suing both their employees are suing their employers and their employer's consultant, right? Because they didn't, the products that they put in front of them from a voluntary benefits perspective were not prudent. There was a lot of money exchanging hands behind the scenes. That was a breach of fiduciary duty and a prohibited transaction. Um, but I guess the elegance of that case, or line of cases, is that they think you're going to get around the standing issue, right? Because um, in the health plan cases, the court said no injury because you got everything you paid for, right? You had a health plan, you got your coverage, and even if it was not the best coverage, it was in your employer's, it was within their trustor duties to do that, and it's, so anyway, no standing. But it's different in this side of the case, this side of the house. Now there's a large contingency of, people like you and me who think that this is like a game changer, and and we're really gonna get into the money that's changing hands in the back rooms between the employers and the third parties involved in these voluntary benefits and the consultants. I myself am probably just too cynical because of the court's treatment of these cases. I actually think they're also going to have a standing issue. If you can't show harm from a drug being marked up 10,000% at the pharmacy counter, right, and having to pay more as a result, how are you going to be able to show harm on a benefit that was purely voluntary, that you didn't have to take, that they didn't have to provide? I just think that the courts might not go there. Um, but if they do, I think the consultants get knocked out of it. No consultant, I've never seen a consultant, at least any of these that are named in the firm, that like, yes, I agree to be a fiduciary on behalf of these plans. Um, the only way they're getting brought back into it is if the employer then sort of, if they say, okay, the employer is liable, that employer is going to turn around and sue the consultant for,
Right.
deceptive, or something, for
Something.
fraudulent inducement or whatever the thing is.
Because the consultant's job is to earn money for their shareholders. That's their job. And in this case, they're looking at all the different voluntary benefits that are available, and they're selecting the benefit that pays them the most, that does the best job for their shareholders. And so, in theory, they're acting as a fiduciary by getting the richest, most bloated voluntary product they can find and attempting to sell that into the workforce. That's them following their fiduciary obligation to their shareholders. And even if we all think it's gross, that's kind of the way that it shakes out for them. So what's the argument there? Is it that, well, you should have been better, or what? Why is it that they have standing?
Well, I think the argument will be, or is, that the consultants exercised discretionary authority over, fiduciary decisions for the health plan. And, to the extent that they didn't disclose the compensation that they were earning on the back end, that doesn't necessarily mean they're a fiduciary. It might mean that they didn't disclose appropriately their compensation, um, which is again why I think that I have a hard time believing that they're going to be found to have be operating in a fiduciary capacity. If anything, it would be the employers. And then the battle between the employers and the consultants would
It
probably.
sort of passes through, because if I got sued based on the way they behaved, I'm going to come for my pound to get back out.
Yeah, but I
Like
mean,
that makes
at
sense.
the end of the day, this is fundamentally what being a fiduciary is about, is not being able to pass the buck, right? Because think about it, if a fiduciary were able to say, yeah, but it wasn't my fault, like they're the ones that did something, that's why you have a heightened standard of care. So that can't happen, right? So if I'm a fiduciary in a sort of a trust, if you're a trustee of an estate, you're a fiduciary, right? And so if I make an investment decision with somebody else's money that has been entrusted to me, and it's a really bad decision, and the person that I invested it with, made a lot of really bad decisions for me financially, um, I don't get to say, yeah, but it was their fault. No, the response from the courts and the law is that you were entrusted with somebody else's funds. You had a heightened obligation to exercise an immense amount of care and loyalty in administering and or taking care of those funds. So whether you're fiduciary in any context. So it does make it a little bit harder to say, yeah, but that guy did it. They made me do it. Or, whatever the
Yeah,
pleading is.
these people were responsible for. I delegated to them responsibility for handling this, but you're not allowed to do
You
that.
can't. Right.
Okay. Wow. Okay.
It really does
Now
distill down to its essence, like why fiduciary duty exists, and to guard against that sort of outsourcing of prudence. You can't do it.
seems a little scary. So if I'm an employer under this new wave of concept around not being able to pass the buck to my consultant, but my consultant may be engaging in stuff that's shady that could be problematic for me. How do I act if I'm running a health plan right now? Is it just more transparency, better scrutiny, make sure that we're RFPing every category? What do I do to protect myself?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's all the things you named. I think it's
Okay.
demanding that the disclosures. And again, it doesn't mean that if your consultant, in this case, let's use this fact pattern, right? If the consultant says, "Yeah, I'm selling you this product because I get the biggest commission," and you know that, and you're able to then evaluate that vendor base or and three others, and you still determine that that's the product you want. If you document that process and that process and that product has a reasonable rate, like it's not ipso facto a breach of your fiduciary duty if conflicts exist, or some of this compensation is flowing back and forth. It's a breach if you don't ask, and then if you ask and you know about it, you don't take it into account when making your decisions.
That's makes perfect sense. You've been on a lot of podcasts and visited with a number of people. I want to talk to you about something maybe that people who have followed you have not heard before, or that we haven't hasn't been discussed before. I'm very curious about this. I believe that with trends continuing as they are, and with this acceleration that we're seeing in the marketplace, there is a reasonable chance that we'll see an expansion of government enablement within healthcare, whether it's single payer, Medicare for all, ICRAs for all, or some type of supplemental cash. I have no idea what they'll come up with, but I think the political winds are blowing that direction. Uh, let's say, for example, that we end up with something that is more similar to Canada, Europe, UK, etc. You live in the UK, you get a first sort of front row seat to how that system is working. Here's the question. If you knew that what you have in the UK is where we're going to be in 2030, and you could go back in time to 2026 and you're managing a health plan, what do you do to get prepared for that?
Whew. Well, what industry am I in? Like, which stakeholder group am
You're
I a part of?
you are running a health plan, you're a large self-funded employer, and they're large self-funded employers. We have lots of employees in all those countries, right? Like my employers in the HA, we have employees in all those countries. And there's always kind of that single payer system, like the government NHS kind of thing. And then there's usually a supplemental layer of like the good stuff, right? So now you go back in time, it's 2026. What do you do as a large employer health plan to get ready so that when in 2030 you don't have mayhem and disruption and long wait times and everything else that comes with single payer?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm a health plan, I am building the infrastructure for my population to be able to access most efficiently and let's just use the UK example, right? Most efficiently use the NHS-like system where appropriate, but make access um, readily available, right? Because I know the pain points being here, and that's access. It's easier
Right.
in the
That's what they all talk about, right? The price, everybody pays the same price, taxes, but access is very challenging.
and we do here, it very much feels like a two-tier system, and I don't think that anybody hides that fact. If you are an executive, I mean, one of the things that when we got the package for my husband's company, the statement was, "Oh, but don't worry, the executives all have private healthcare." And I've experienced that. My kids go to a private school. Almost all of the parents at it is a two-tier system. And I think there's even an understanding and an acceptance here that if that two-tier system didn't exist and everybody that operates in that private system had to access care from the NHS directly, it would even further buckle, almost may break. They very much rely on that private system to keep things running.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So, I would prepare again by like knowing what some of the challenges are. and trying to, again, build the infrastructure, culture, um, to make the most of that system. And I think it is going to come down to, you're right, the way that we're headed, and the Wall Street Journal articles this week really bear this out. It's like healthcare is growing, right? And it's the sole driver of job growth, and it's
Right, all the jobs are going into this, which is not a productive unit of the economy. It's just not, it's restorative.
when you see that against the, like, we're losing manufacturing jobs, we're losing, list all of these industries. But I know you work with those industries too, Lee, one of the reasons that those industries aren't gaining like adding jobs is because the cost of adding those jobs includes a $26,000 per year, like, overhead. It's like out of the
Yeah,
gate.
non-salary, like, that's just
So at what point do those meet and we realize the absurdity of the situation we found ourselves in? It's also not something that you can necessarily um out sorry export or increase foreign demand, right? Like, yes, we could engage in medical tourism, I guess, but, like, at some point, like, the demand is only coming from inside, and so we're not becoming more productive, right? Like, we're not selling more productive or, beneficial units. We're just yeah, the math doesn't make sense. And so have you ever watched Arrested Development?
I've seen clips.
Okay, well, there's a great scene, and it really reminds me of this, in that, and the young man in that, he's selling bananas out of a hut, and one of his coworkers said, "Well, if we earn $10, we get to leave earlier. So let's just, we'll get there faster if we just fudge the books." And so she'd throw away a banana, and then she'd take $1 out of the cash machine, and then she'd throw away a banana, and then she'd take $1 out of the cash machine and say, "See, now we're ready to go." And it's like the math, the absurdity of that, it doesn't make sense.
Everyone, now just a quick word from today's sponsor.
Mom, are you crying?
No, sweetie. Just some allergies. Come here. Let's go play. Come on.
1 in 4 Americans had trouble paying a recent medical bill. Many of these people affected work for companies just like yours. Start giving your employees 100% medical coverage with Catalyze Health.
That's exactly it. In economics, we used to talk about, it's like, okay, some dollars go to make new stuff, and other dollars go to clean up messes. And if you spend all your money cleaning up messes, you haven't made anything at all, and you're just poor. And it's like if a hurricane hit every month, or a flood, flooded a house on the coast, on the coastal waters of Florida or something like that every month, and you had to rebuild, that would generate a lot of economic activity, but it doesn't do any good we all acknowledge that's not good. That's just cleaning up messes. That's restoring what we have or maintaining. And those are not productive dollars. They don't make any new widgets. There's no new TVs, no new schools or education. Nothing productive comes out of it. And healthcare is just that. It's just cleaning up after the hurricane, the flood, or the tornado, and just better at individual level.
We don't do a great job of it either. So when we talk about is, but those articles, we're dumping more and more money into, if you were to say yes, but we're getting a more productive society as a result.
Yeah, we're not living. I mean, if we added 10 years each time to our life expectancy, that also
That we're
would be expensive in
productive,
its own right.
right?
But it would be, yeah, like we'd be getting something for that. But we haven't gained life expectancy. Totally flat, maybe a little down. It just depends. Uh, it's wild. How do we think now, transitioning over to uh the settlement in New Jersey? This is a big milestone. It represents kind of a cap of a number of issues that we're finding everywhere in society that sort of came to a sort of a climactic point with with New Jersey. Would you mind telling a little bit, just kind of summarizing what's been going on there, and then distilling it into how should I think about that if I'm running a health plan right now?
Sure. Yeah, so just a little history. Uh, so I left the state in 2021, and part of the reason I left was because of what was ultimately, part of this whistleblower lawsuit. That I uncovered it. I brought it to the attention of those who it should be brought to their attention, including AGs and treasurer's office, governor's office, and ultimately nothing happened. And I was told nothing will happen. So I left. We filed the whistleblower complaint, and it took almost 5 years of investigation at both the federal and the state level, because there were federal dollars involved, to ultimately reach this settlement with Horizon Blue Cross Blue Shield for $100 million. Sounds like a big number. It is a big number for the state. Um, don't want to diminish that, but I do think there was a lot left on the table. Um, and the settlement of it was really just a settlement of one discrete set of issues within a much broader set of issues that are still under seal. But essentially, I discovered that the state was paying substantially more than billed charges on claims that were being processed through the Blue Card system. We had Blue Cross Blue Shield, and uh, and now that might not necessarily be problematic for many plans because their contracts might allow for that. But our contract had a very specific provision that said we would never pay more than the billed or negotiated amount. And some might think, well, why would you ever need that, right? Like, why would we ever pay more than the billed amount? We're told all the time that we get discounts. We never place
It discounts.
we never pay sticker price. But it turns out that in many cases, we pay substantially over sticker price. In one case, I think, the example that gets all the attention, there was a $675,000 claim from New York Presbyterian, and the state ultimately paid out $2.1 million, over 2.1 million. And the response was, yeah, but that's what the negotiated rate was. And when we pushed back and said, well, why would the hospital bill, like, did they not bill this correctly, or why, or did you just way overpay? And they said, oh, well, sometimes they bill it, if it's a negotiated rate, sometimes the bills aren't, you can't really look at those numbers. And um that's when I knew I had to like keep digging. But yeah, I mean, in 50 claims alone, we paid over the billed amount by $12 million. That's 50 claims. So at a $4 billion plan, you can imagine how much money this was worth. But yeah, ultimately came to an agreement. The state steps into the shoes of the whistleblowers. So the state is the one that manages the settlement agreement, the settlement amount. We have to ultimately sign off on it, and did so that the state could get the $100 million. And that's where it sits. I mean, they're still fighting. We're still fighting in court to get the remainder of the complaint unsealed, because there's a lot more in it that I think is relevant for plans around the country. But again, not just that one discrete issue. If you're a health plan and you think you're getting a discount on every claim, think again. Like, the aggregate discount that they show you at the end of the year that you achieved is definitely excluding, not just, on a claim by claim basis, like claims that you might have paid over the billed amount. But you really have to dig into that fine print when they're sort of delivering their report on the rebate guarantee, or not rebate guarantees, the discount guarantee, to see what they've excluded from that discount guarantee. Have they excluded out-of-state claims? Have they excluded outliers? Have they excluded, whatever the exclusions are? What was their methodology in coming up with that? I think that's the moral of the story is we can't, we have to do a lot more than just checking the math.
I'm running a health plan. We have this great new knowledge. What are some tactical things that I can do to capture value from this knowledge and protect myself as well?
Well, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it all starts with having some level of access to your data.
Okay.
For me to uncover what I just described was literally an Excel spreadsheet with, you know, several dozen fields, but it was something I'm not a data scientist, I could look at very easily and discover something was wrong. So really, the most robust level of data is obviously would be ideal, but you can do a lot without having 16 data scientists on your team, in a room looking at this stuff all day and every day, if you know what you need to
Wow.
look for. Yeah, and I guess the moral of the story is, and going back to what we talked about with the consultants, is it is not that these organizations are out to get you. It's not that these organizations are like morally bad or corrupt. It is that these organizations also have shareholders to answer to. They have boards to answer to, and they have business models that have developed as a result of the way that the market works that are not in your interest, right? And that's part of your job as a health plan, is to deconstruct. And I like this idea of first principles. If you were to, what is your goal as a health plan? Right. High quality, affordable healthcare for my employees, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
to keep them happy, healthy, on the job, and retain and attract.
If I wanted to do those things and I had a blank slate, would I build the system that we have today in order to accomplish those things?
No, you
Absolutely
do
not.
something as different as possible, ostensibly.
So I think if you strip back to what the outcome you want, and you look at how you are trying to achieve that outcome, do everything you can, recognize the truths that exist, right? Incentives mean something. Um, if you can re-engineer as much as as much as you can to get to that outcome, if you had that blank slate, and maybe this is a 5 or 10 year strategy, and you're doing something each year to get to that future state. But I think one of the problems we suffer from today is this idea of optimizing what exists to the greatest of our ability. So we look at the system we have today, and we look at renewal cycles, and we look at point solutions, and we look at all of the things as they exist today, and how can I squeeze the most value out of what exists today, instead of saying, this is where I want to be, this is where I'm starting. Like, how do I come up with a plan to evolve past and not just optimize what we have today, but reimagine it to get to my final destination.
Drucker says something that keys into this really well. There's nothing, some version of, there's nothing worse than doing more efficiently that which should not be done at all.
There, that's it.
And I think I might be the king of that. I spend 80 hours a week in R&D into optimizing a system, but this is a refreshing way to think about, okay, step back and let's reinvestigate, at least periodically, everything that we're doing from the lens of what do we want, and is this the best way to get there? I love finishing on that. What a wonderful thought. This has been outstanding. Chris, if people want to connect with you better, learn more about what you're doing, continuing the conversation with you, what's the best way for them to find you?
Yeah, I'm very active on LinkedIn. So I've tried to put out some great content there on a pretty regular basis. You can also email me directly, chris@judygroup.com, or you can, DM me on LinkedIn. And I also have a Substack that I try to update as regularly as possible.
I love it. Thank you so much. This has been terrific, and appreciate everyone listening in today. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us on Broken Benefits. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcasting platform. Also, please share today's show with a friend or colleague. It's free to do, and it helps us spread the message to as many people as possible. Until next time.